the majority in society or have been marginalized in speaking out and in kind of exercising their human rights in the public and digital space. So I think we also will have to look at the design and deployment and development of technology about biases that are often introduced or kind of like brought into technology, and then if they're kind of like deployed in the digital setting, then we have not only a reproduction of these asymmetric power structures we have in the offline world and we have seen, and all these biases and challenges, but they're really being reinforced and amplified in the digital setting, which then again kind of like impacts back into society. So I think it's really a great opportunity with the Best Practice Forum, but also this panel to kind of like address all this from a more holistic approach. And there are two more things I would like to say at this kind of like starting point, which is the first, also linked a little bit to this holistic approach that I think is so crucially important, is that we see barriers and obstacles, challenges really at every step. So at the question of like women being able to speak out, participate, but also then the way they're targeted when they do so, which we have also seen this week in the very first session, which was on the feminist web, where there were really very misogynist and sexual graphic attacks on Zoom, for example, which means when we speak about specific things, we as society become targets, but then also the impact it has later on. So I'm sure we will dive deeper into this as well in the second round, but I want to mention it already now, and that this really impacts, of course, the individual woman who wants to speak out or the marginalized person, but it really impacts society. It impacts our democratic governance, our possibilities to really create a peaceful and democratic kind of like common, just community and world we want to live in. And the last point I want to say at this stage, because I'm representing an intergovernmental organization, that I think we need, of course, a whole of society approach. So I think it's important to have these different perspectives. But I want to speak a little bit about the positive obligation and human rights obligations of states. And this is something Thea already touched upon, and I'm grateful for that. I think we really always have to consider and remember that states have a positive human rights obligation to protect, to fulfill, and to really realize our human rights, online and offline. And we have plenty of human rights, including freedom of expression, media freedom, which are more the rights I am working on, but also specific women rights. And there's really an obligation. We have this kind of international rule set work already out there. And then this means that it also needs to be ensured via regulation. So I think that kind of like linking back to the title of today's session, whether regulation is friend or foe, regulatory responses are important, of course, but all of us know, and I think we have heard plenty of examples throughout the week, that unfortunately also legislation has often been misused or been adopted under false pretexts, or they are just taking place also in a specific context and setting. So the question is, who is the legislator, whose concerns are being addressed, who sits at the table? I mean, all these things, it's never a silo. So I think this is important to consider. So the question of friend or foe is, of course, not easily to be responded, which, of course, is also the intention of this panel. But I think it is important to have regulation, but to ensure that it's properly done. But I do think that we need transformative change, and any social change builds on various aspects, including also regulation and legislatory approaches. So I think they are necessary, but we have to really be cautious that they are developed in a proper way, and then also throughout the entire regulatory cycle that we have heard before, also the implementation and enforcement, of course, is crucially important. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. I think you brought up some really cross-cutting considerations, from representation to positive obligations, as well as going beyond this violence narrative when it comes to addressing gender and digital rights in terms of regulations. And I think last but not least, we have Bia Barbosa, who's a journalist and a human rights specialist. She's also a civil society representative in the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee. Thank you for joining us today, Bia. And if you can give us your introductory remarks and the state of activism, I guess, in Brazil or Latin America. Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you, Mara. Thank you very much for the invitation and also for the amazing job that the BPF on gender and digital rights are doing, and congrats as well for the report that is ongoing. I've read it, and I took some parts that I'm going to comment in the second round here. So thank you very much for this space. I speak here as a journalist that who has closely followed the problem of women journalists being attacked online for the last year. And if we look at the data of journalists killed in the world, and especially in Latin America, for example, where 90% of the killed journalists are men, we may have a wrong conclusion about violence related to journalists, because we may think that if 90% of the journalists killed are men, there's no problems with women journalists. So it's the opposite, because the digital environment has been a very difficult place for women journalists to work, and the initiatives and the campaigns, the violent campaigns against women journalists that have been developed online everywhere in the world have been very effective in silencing women journalists. For example, this year, I work also for Reporter Without Borders office in Latin America, and during the elections in Brazil this year, we followed the accounts of 120 journalists in Brazil, and from August to October only, in this period, we registered around 3 million offensive messages, and also posts that seek to discredit the work of the press in general. And the reports we published in the RSF website show that every week 4 women occupied the list of the 5 most attacked journalists in Brazil. So the most part of them on Twitter. So the volume of this aggression is frightening. They were campaigns coordinated by extremely right-wing groups, supporters of the current president of Brazil, who lost the elections, with highly misogynic characteristics and sexual connotations. When black journalists, black women journalists were targeted, of course, the messages were also racist. So, and the impact of this violence has been measured worldwide, not only in Brazil, but in Brazil, a research that we have conducted with Gender and Number, Gênero e Número organization, Brazilian organizations as well, showed that at least 15% of women and LGBT journalists who have experienced online aggression have developed mental health problems. So the impacts are very, not only, it goes beyond the idea of silencing these women, but it's also we have developed mental health, they have developed mental health problems. In this scenario, I think the response from digital platforms were practically nil. Journalists are not recognized by this company, at least not from the standing point of their policies and terms of use, as a group that needs to be protected so that the population's right to access to accurate information is guaranteed. And despite all the research and the evidence all over the world, social networks continue to be a permissive space for constant and organized violence against the press. And as we all know, this is not exclusive to journalists. Of course, we're talking here about women and LGBT and minority groups, and in an ongoing basis, it seems to me that we have a regulatory debate to be established relating to violence against journalists as well. Because as in other aspects, the companies have not responded to the challenge that we have been observed. I agree with the points brought by Mariana related to different aspects of regulation, and it's very positive that the feminist and the women movement has already advanced in this agenda, but from the journalist perspective, this topic is still quite a taboo. Because there is, and it's quite distant from the community of journalists in general, mainly because there is a natural and a justified resistance of journalists to regulations related to freedom of expression, because in the most part of the time, these regulations are used to silence journalists everywhere. But I believe that this case, the level of the violence that we have reached means that we can no longer avoid the debate because it's the absence of regulation, or the social media and the platforms regulation that is now silencing women journalists. So I think that we have to move forward and tackle this debate, of course, putting all the human rights standards on the table, but I think that it can be no longer a taboo for us journalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Bia. I think you really highlighted an important issue, which is the offline-online kind of dichotomy, where we see a lot of incidents online escalating to killings offline. And I think it's very important to bring this to the fore when it comes to the regulation debate. And perhaps just following up on this, I'll go back to Mahima. Yeah, can you please tell us more how Bumble is really trying to approach these issues, and how can you make sure that the dating app is safe for women users and people from diverse genders and sexualities? Thank you.
Yeah, happy to share some of what Bumble has been doing. So Bumble, as you know, is it's a women-first dating app, and the whole mission is to have like healthy and equitable relationships, which we know are challenged not just online but offline as well. So it's a tall mandate. We have done some research in understanding what are the points of challenge for women when they come online and when they spend time on an app like Bumble. So, for example, unwanted contact, which, of course, we're talking about in the context of activists in much more violent contexts. But unwanted contact is an area of concern for a lot of women. And that's one of the reasons they don't like to be online. So by its very design that women make the first move, that is a point of friction in the entire experience of dating online, where a woman is not inundated with messages. She is more in control of who is able to message her, because she has a little bit of control in terms of that first contact that is made. Similarly, unwanted images, lewd pictures, or, pardon my French, but, dick pics that people, refer to, that is also a form of abuse that takes place online, and it is really jarring and would keep women, offline, or certainly off one platform or the other. So what Bumble did was we used a proprietary technology to blur these images within the Bumble app. And users could choose whether they wanted to see the image, because it is an app which has consensual conversations as well. So it could be an image that was sent through consent. We don't know that as Bumble, but it is blurred so that people don't have to view it and they can report it to Bumble directly. What Bumble has done in the recent past is actually open sourced this technology. So now others online, if they want to actually adopt this technology into their platforms, and their spaces, they can do that. Similarly, what Bumble did on the policy side was go and find out, markets and areas and countries in which some of these behaviors were crimes offline, but were not captured online, and have actually, worked in 6 states in the US and also in the UK when the online safety bill was being discussed, to actually highlight that cyber flashing is something that needs to be captured within the law, so that when women go to the police to say this happened to me, they are not told, we know it's wrong, but it's not illegal. So, and just a last, so there are, we're making efforts to make the internet ecosystem, not just on Bumble, but outside Bumble, safer for women, because we believe that then it would become safer for everyone. And just to point to the mental health, the aspect that you mentioned, when someone is the victim of online abuse and certainly sexual assault or violence, we know that, one thing online is always taking the account off, the post off, and that seems like a victory. But we also at Bumble are aware that there could be, a need for talking to a counselor or a therapist. And so Bumble has actually partnered with an organization called Cheyenne, which is a French NGO. And the program that we offer is Bloom. And so our users can actually access either self-guided courses or speak to a therapist via chat or in-person sessions, if they have been the victim of such an incident online, or even offline if they met somebody through our app. So we're trying to take a holistic approach to see how we can make Bumble safer, certainly, but also can the effects benefit the rest of the online ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Mahima, for this. And perhaps also just following up on the mental health issue, I'll go to you, Onika. And I know you're really showing a strong sensitivity to a lot of issues that are and dynamics that are affecting women and other disadvantaged populations. Today, to what extent you see the issue around mental health and trauma-informed spaces is really echoing within the regulatory space, especially in Africa where there's a lot of conflicts and people need counseling and support, and when it comes to trauma and violent images and images of rape and really shocking graphics online.
Great question. I think we can almost thank the COVID experience for at least highlighting some of these issues, especially in sectors where they have predominantly been ignored. However, one of the things that I'm seeing is that we are now finally open to having these discussions and even updating some of the policies and laws. So, for example, South Africa has one of, I think what we've been talking about is one of the latest and most up-to-date cyber criminal bills that we have so far in the region. Yet we are still faced with a challenge of, having a bill that's considered to be progressive on these issues, but a law enforcement regime that's not knowledgeable and educated about how to enforce these laws that exist. So I think, so we sort of have this gap of policy and implementation, which is something I think that plagues this region a lot. We are really good at adopting conventions and treaties at international level. We are also great at updating our national laws, but implementation just doesn't seem to happen as fast. And I think that we have an opportunity to recognize that there is a capacity deficit that exists with the current enforcement agencies that we have right now and the laws that we've either adopted or are seeking for them to adopt. So we have to make sure that we do this capacity development for these agencies so that they understand these issues. The other thing that I think that gets us into a bit of a conundrum, especially in the region, is the issue of language, because sometimes the language in itself is violent. And it takes a while for us to recognize that, because that we are here speaking English is actually not a natural thing even for me, right? So sometimes, and we see this, I think the platforms have a lot of this experience when it comes to moderating speech online, because, our biggest complaints now has been that it's not localized, this moderation of speech. So when I report something, and I'll just give you an example, and I apologize that it's really graphic, where the gentleman, well, I don't know, we can call him a gentleman. But anyway, this particular male person posted online on one social media platform that the vagina of a young girl is nice, however, society has a problem with it. But what they did is that they posted it in their vernacular language. So for English moderators, this is meaningless, right? And even when we attempted to translate it for them and report it and consistently say, this is violent, right? It's statutorily, it just rings all the bells. We still got this classic standard response of, this does not violate our community standards. So the question comes, who sets these community standards? Who is the community? If we are sitting here in this region and our speech moderators are sitting in another continent and may or may not understand our language, and yes, there is the automatic translation online, but the context requires some level of nuance as well that goes beyond just simple translation. So I'll leave it at that, to say that we have finally recognized the issues. I think we are all quite conversant on what's bad about what's happening right now and what we need to adopt in terms of how to fix it. But implementation is still just really hitting us badly.
Thank you, Onika. And I think, yeah, this just sounds music to my ear. Whose community standards are these? And perhaps this is also a note to my BPF team to add this to the report. So I'll just swing back to you, Bia. I know you have time constraints. And I know you also had comments on the report, which you're welcome to present to us. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I would just like to take advantage of one case that you mentioned in the report to stress that we really need to be careful about regulation, even if I support platforms regulation regarding violence, gender-based violence and violence against journalists. And I would like to share an example what happened last year in Brazil related to that, and is one of the cases that you mentioned in your report. In 2021, President Jair Bolsonaro issued a provisional executive order that intended to forbid the practice of content moderation, except in justified cases, under the pretense of allowing ample freedom of expression, communication, and thought in Brazil. Although the provisional measure established exemptions by denying, as a general rule, the prohibition of content removal with sanctions of non-compliance, the regulation would create an online environment prone to the circulation of harmful speech, particularly distorted speech of political gender violence, hate speech, and misinformation targeting women and LGBT people. Among the exceptions of the text, content authorized to be excluded or blocked by the platforms would be content that would be related to incitement of acts of threat of violence, including reasons for discrimination or prejudice of race, color, sex, ethnicity, religion, and sexual orientation. There was no mention of gender-based violence among the listed bypass possibilities, what would open a gap for the maintenance of this type of discourse on social networks, and denied since the beginning the existence of such forms of discriminations. The President of the Senate summarily rejected the executive order, but there are still some bills in the Brazilian parliament that propose this type of limitation to the operation of the social networks. I also would like to reinforce, I think that Julie would be able to go further the joint declaration, but I just would like to comment two recommendations of the Joint Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Gender Justice. One of them says that in consultation with media organizations and representatives of women journalists, states should develop and implement integrated prevention, protection, monitoring, and response mechanisms to ensure the safety of women journalists. And here we have a big problem, because many journalist protection policies in different parts of the world are not developed with a gender perspective, and they totally ignore digital security protection measures. When you look to at least at the Latin America protection mechanisms for journalists, at the beginning they were able to look for threats on social networks, but they don't have specific digital measures to protect journalists after that. And another recommendation is that, of course, the internet intermediaries should be particularly mindful on the way that their services, automated or algorithmic process in business practice to increase user engagement, target advertising, or engaging in profile mainly amplified gender stereotypes, bias, and misogyny and gender-based violence. and that the company should ensure that their content moderation and curation policy and practice do not discriminate on the basis of gender and other protected attributes. We are very, very, very far from this reality. I believe that as activists, we should take advantage of a broad debate that is going on about platform regulation in different parts of the world to address this issue, especially violence against women journalists. UNESCO, for example, should launch in February a global framework for regulation of platforms. It will also be a document of recommendations. And we have already many recommendation documents everywhere. So it's not a problem that not knowing what to do. The recommendations are there. But I think that is a multilateral tool that can be used in advocacy strategies in different countries to ensure the adoption of a more protective legislation. The idea, for example, of risk assessment, which is already presenting in the Digital Service Act in Europe, is a topic that could be interesting for a more protective approach for journalists. I believe that UNESCO framework could go on this direction. The document is still open to contribution, so I think that we could take advantage of this space to reinforce the recommendations that the Joint Declaration brought us. And finally, I would like to share with you an initiative that we are developing the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, which we also hope can contribute to adoption of policies and regulations that promote diversity in the digital environment and in the ICT sector. It's called the Gender and Diversity Agenda, a project that has been implemented since 2021 by the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee, the CGI, and the agenda has 10 challenges and more than 240 proposals of actions to implement this challenge, to face this challenge. As our committee, as CGI, the agenda is a multi-stakeholder document. He's not published yet. He's being building by consultations inside Brazil and outside as well. We organized it here at the IGF and a workshop yesterday sharing this experience. So I invite you also to know this this initiative that we hope that can foster a more protective regulation, but also a regulation that is based on human rights standards. Thank you very much, and I'm really sorry that I need to leave early. I will stay with you 5 more minutes, but I have a panel that starts at 3. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bia. And I think staying within the Brazilian space, I would go back to you, Mariano. And I know that you worked a lot on bodily issues, and I know that regulation is not really in good terms with women's bodies. And yeah, I mean, I know you would have to address these issues. Perhaps you have slides to present,
yes,
right?
Yes, please.
So,
if you can screen them, technical team, thank you very much. So thank you. It's really, really interesting to hear you all, and I appreciate many of the remarks that have been made. So Julia's remarks on how regulation is one of the strategies for addressing states' positive obligations. And also I think Bia, who has been a very important promoter of gender digital rights in Brazil, she already spoke a little bit of regulations gone wrong, let's say. But I wanted to speak of this general framework of the laws that have been approved in Brazil in the past 10 years to address especially gender-based violence and different aspects of gender-based violence. And just as an introduction, I think there are 2 things that are important to say. The first is that, of course, legislation, regulations, they have different roles. And we know, feminists know very well that one of them is symbolic. So, for example, when the Supreme Court decided in 2018 that LGBT that speech against LGBT, hate speech against LGBT was encompassed in the anti-discrimination law in Brazil, that becomes really a narrative also strategy, right? It becomes part of the strategy of the movement to say, look, this is illegal, this is something that's not allowed. So we know that symbols are important, but I'm going to address more the effects, the proper effects of the laws here. And the second thing, which I think is also a general comment, is that there's a lot of discussion in Brazil and a lot of criticism on the role of criminalization for our movements, especially because as we're in a very unequal country, we know that criminal law affects different groups differently, and especially black people are disproportionately affected by the criminal system. So this is something that I think is also like a general approach to the issue, because that's a backfire in itself, right? When we approved laws that criminalize, that's always something that has to be taken into consideration as well. And that said, I really just wanted to show this quick framework that I've been working on, and that's, I don't think it encompasses everything, but that's I think they are the most important laws that have been approved in the past 10 years to address gender-based violence. And I wanted to focus on 2 of them, which I think we can refer to as having had backfire, let's say. Let me see if I can move. I don't think so. Can you move to the next one, please? Yeah, good. So the first one is one that was called Carolina Dickman law, and it's interesting that many of these laws, they have names of women because they really followed controversial cases that were very mediatized. And this law was approved in 2012 after this woman who is an actress, she had her pictures disseminated online. And that case became very well known. It was one of the first very well-known cases of intimate images being disseminated. And it generated a lot of public discussion, and right after it happened, this law was approved. The law criminalizes hacking into another person's computing device. And if you can take it to the next one, please. Pass the slide. Thank you. What I wanted to show is that although this law was approved to address, supposedly to address this case, and it even carries the name of Carolina, it doesn't really address her story because her device wasn't really hacked. That's not really what happened. What happened in her story was that her email was invaded, and this law doesn't really address that specific situation. So there was a big narrative in the media of how now there were laws in place to protect situations like Carolina's, and it wasn't really so. And as you can see, one of the paragraphs of this law establishes that the penalty is increased by 1/3 to 1/2 if the crimes committed against the President of the Republic, the President of the Federal Supreme Court, and so forth, showing that perhaps protecting women wasn't exactly the reason why this law was approved in the first place, right? So sometimes there's a lot of narrative about something being protective of women's rights online. When you really look into it, that's not really the case. And then, yeah. And then I'd like to address another one that was approved more recently, and that's the stalking law. And this was also considered somewhat of a victory for a feminist movement that had been speaking of how these actions of stalking, of persecuting someone repeatedly, they really didn't find an expression in the legal framework, because we're often speaking of very, let's say, small actions that per se are not illegal, right? So for example, sending someone a message is not illegal. Adding someone through another profile is not illegal. But when you look at them systematically, you see that there's a situation there that's causing a lot of distress, right? So this law was finally approved to address this, but digital rights activists at the time were already trying to address that maybe the definition here was a bit too broad, and it could be used against activists, and that's precisely what happened. So perhaps you've heard of Sleeping Giants. Sleeping Giants is an organization that it's not really an organization, so it's different groups in different countries, but it's a strategy, let's say, that has been used against certain profiles, certain people, certain companies, to make it very visible when they're, for example, acting against democracy or against human rights. And Sleeping Giants, what it does is to make campaigns against certain actors. And what happened in the specific case that I wanted to show you, and sorry that it's also very bad language, this TV presenter, he said live on TV that gays were a disgraced race. And then Sleeping Giants started to campaign against this person, asking basically funders, what's the name of the advertisers to stop advertising for the program, and Siqueira Jr., the Stevie presented, he sued them for stalking, because what he said was that he was being persecuted repeatedly by them, by this campaign online, and that was harming his psychological integrity and invading or disturbing his freedom or privacy. And he actually got an injunction against Sleeping Giants, which obliged them to stop this campaign. So this is just another example of how we have to really carefully craft these laws when we're thinking of protecting. Of course, the intention was clearly really good, but how do you clearly craft it out so that it doesn't really backlash, right? There would be many different things for me to address in these different laws as well, but I think for the sake of time, I will stop here, and then perhaps in the discussion I can address other situations in which these regulations have gone wrong as well.
Thank you, Mariana. I think it's very essential to have a bigger picture of what's going on, and it's good to have you here portraying the Brazilian landscape. I know we've been diving a lot on gender and women's rights issues, and I would like to go back to the corporate conduct. I know that you, Theo, spoke about the downstream due diligence. Perhaps because we have, an interdisciplinary audience, if you can tell us more about what does that mean and how we can really conduct due diligence against a backdrop of a fragmented regulatory framework that overlooks these issues that we've been speaking on. Thank you.
Thank you. So to start, maybe it could be helpful to explain a little bit more about Ericsson as a company. So we are what is usually called a network vendor. So we're not an operator, internet service provider, or platform. So we are not facing those types of issues of, for example, government requests and so on. But what we do is develop the technology, design and develop the solutions, the technology that then enables operators, platforms, and so on. So one example of, of course, we have ongoing kind of downstream due diligence in our sales process, where we always evaluate what type of technology we are selling, in what context, to what customer, how can it be misused, and can we build in certain safeguards from a technical perspective, but also contractually with the customer, for example, limiting the use of the technology. But some examples additionally of how we kind of proactively address these issues and that tie into the topic of women's rights specifically on tech is that we last year published a human rights assessment of 5G technology. So as a network vendor, we of course are kind of the key player in developing and enabling 5G technology, being then the new generation of mobile networks. And we wanted to, at the early stage, address potential issues of misuse or how kind of already known risks for human rights and women's rights can be materialized in different or new ways with 5G technology, or also potentially exacerbated. And I'll just give you a few examples. The full report is available on our website, so you're more than welcome to read the full report. But some examples that we looked into are, for example, the increased use of IoT devices. So already with issues of, for example, domestic surveillance, with increased use of IoT devices, that potentially open up for other types of surveillance or surveillance through new products, of course, increase that risk for already marginalized and at-risk groups. And an additional issue with IoT devices is that the third parties that create these IoT devices not always have the same kind of strong encryption of, for example, other handheld devices, or are not as used to dealing with issues of privacy and freedom of expression. So there is an important role of course, raising awareness with those third parties on how to design those products with that in mind. Another issue that is definitely not new to this space is network shutdowns, but again, from the perspective of 5G technology, with more dense deployment of cell towers or cells, that also potentially enables more precise network shutdowns. So while today maybe you need to shut down an entire region or a block in a city, this will potentially be able to then target specific, even a building or a specific person, for example. And then the third one is network segmentation. So again, I mean, kind of the legitimate use of that is, of course, to optimize how the network functions and to make sure that the kind of focus of the network is diverged into prioritized areas and so on, such as, for example, healthcare. But again, misuse that could lead to, for example, throttling or more, again, precise limitations of who has accessibility to the network and services such as digital healthcare, education, and so on. So these are just some of the few issues that we addressed in the report. You're, of course, more than...
I'm not very comfortable with. Nah. The
Sorry?
volume is missing.
Can we please mute the Zoom?
Just to wrap up, then I'll say that, I mean, we've talked about legislation, but what's also important in our industry, particularly to address these issues, is through standardization. Because that's at the early stage of where we agree on how products are developed, what kind of safeguards need to be in place. So that's an additional way that we are working to address these issues, is in standardization bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. I think it gives a very nice picture of how corporate conducts different risks assessments in order to make sure that they address a lot of human rights issues. And I guess speaking of internet shutdowns and free speech, I'll go back to you, Julia. And I guess you would want to tackle the declaration, but it would also be nice if you can also talk us through how you see media regulation against, the background of crackdown on journalists and shrinking of civic spaces, and how can we make sure that, yes, regulation, it is necessary, but at the same time, we do not create a chilling effect on freedom of expression. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this really pertinent question. And there, I think we don't have enough time to speak about all the really excellent points that we already heard in the course of the last hour. I wanted to start with following up on something that Bia said before. That's really this kind of like limiting, and also links a little bit to your question, limiting speech to protect speech, right? So I think this is really what we need to acknowledge, that the notion of we need all like limitless freedom of expression means that there is a de facto limitation of speech of some, right? Through violence, through business practices, through all these different things we have been discussing. So regulation really needs to take on this role of ensuring that free speech for everyone is available, right? And that participatory and inclusive freedom of expression is possible. So I just wanted to kind of start with this with this point, but also kind of like recognizing that all the things that we've been discussing throughout the week really have this gendered perspective. And one of the points is this really kind of like lack of rule of law also in a digital context. So I want to maybe say two more things before I go into the joint declaration. Thanks for mentioning it, and then also going to your question about media regulation, is really trying to consider the entire kind of like lifeline of a speech. When we now take the example of freedom of expression, I mentioned already before that we have to recognize kind of like every step. So it's really about access to technology, access to means of expression, digital divides. It's the question of literacy and access to education and all these kind of points, even before we can look at who is even able to participate in kind of like the public sphere and freedom of expression. Then we have speaking out, and here again we have a very clear link to what Bia said before about speaking out publicly, for example, because you're a woman journalist or because you're a woman politician, which is also something that was addressed already at this IGF, puts the person at an additional kind of like risk of being targeted and being silenced. And then we also see that there are specific restrictions of gendered expression. And for example, the reproductive health issue that was mentioned before. And then we also see that all the kind of already problems and challenges that we see are amplified in a digital context where we have platforms that are really kind of prioritizing user engagement in view of advertising revenues, even if it's at odds with public good, with diversity, with accuracy, which brings along so many additional kind of like challenges. But I think I'm now trying to move away from the challenges because I think we have established many of them, but kind of like, what can we do? So indeed, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, together with the other free speech mandate holders, have this year issued a joint declaration that kind of for the first time really touches upon this horizontal issue of gender and gender justice in freedom of expression. And it puts forward several recommendations for different stakeholders, including also media outlets, but also platforms, when we speak about due diligence and many of the things that Theo touched upon, but also really looking at states and what needs to be done to remove the structural and systemic inequalities and barriers that we see, and discrimination that we see also reinforced in the digital context. 2 points in this context that we heard before when Marianne, you mentioned also that judges judge on morals, and kind of like, so it's also a question who are enforcing, who are sitting at kind of like the decision-making power, again, in different steps. But it's also that very often public morals that are also understood from a very patriarchal value system is very often used as an excuse to protect, or it's this kind of like paternalistic approach to protect women online by in fact restricting their expression and possibility to speak out online. And this links back to this kind of like freedom always has to be inclusive, because otherwise it's a privilege of some, which means it's not freedom and it's not right for everybody. I also brought a few joint declarations in case you want to grab it. It's, of course, also online. But in the sake of time, just 2 more small things, because I think it's really important also to touch upon the safety of women journalists online, which also links to the question about media regulation specifically, where we have, like the OSCE has worked on it for quite a while. I also brought a resource guide, because I think what we tried is also moving away from these recommendations. We heard that there are plenty of recommendations and documents out there of what should be done, but really trying to look at how should it be done, right? How was it already successful in a specific context? What are the good practice examples that we can learn from? And seeing what the different stakeholders, be it the legislative, be it the executive branch, be it the judiciary, but also the law enforcement, which very often is kind of like this first step of institutionalized impunity when we speak about online violence and attacks and restrictions. So there are all these different actors, and we really need this kind of like whole of society approach, but recognizing that the safety of journalists, as one of the examples, is a broad concept, right? So safety does not only mean not to be killed, as was pointed out by Pia, but also psychological health, also legal safety, and all these different aspects. So it's really also about safety protocols and all these other things. In this context, it's relevant also to mention the monitoring, I think, of online attacks, because if we look at the cases of where really violence against women journalists escalated into horrific online attacks or offline violence or even assassinations of women journalists, you can really look at the history of attacks online beforehand. So I think it's really crucially important, and this is something that we are working on now together with Julie Possetti from ICFJ, to really try to identify indicators for escalation so that we can move from this denouncing when something happened to really a preventive approach and saying online violence is first of all a kind of indication for potential offline violence later, and worst case scenario impunity or impunity for killings. But we also need to take those and learn from what has happened and when something went wrong to see how can we prevent it in the future. And the second point is platform governance. I mean, it was touched upon a little bit by Theo, but in the online context, most of the power and gatekeeping to information and gatekeeping to information spaces is really held by a handful of corporations, of companies, that are all based also in Silicon Valley. So there are many other issues to that as well that we have discussed during the week. But there's also a lack of transparency, accountability, and inclusiveness in the process that are being developed. And here I just want to point out one point, that if gender and human rights is not considered from the very beginning, really from the question of designing and developing technologies and setting the rules for the spaces where people can speak out, it's very difficult to bring it in later, and you will have all these gendered impacts and effects. So human rights due diligence is crucially important, and it of course has to include this gender perspective, but then also be clearly linked to mitigation measures that again have this gender perspective in there. And here's really where regulation plays in, and where states have to make sure that this framework, this for online speech is set, but not focusing on content. I think this was also made clear before, but really focusing on the processes. So focusing on the reach of speech and not the speech itself. So I already see the pointing to the hand, so I will close with that. But we also work on this platform governance, and I brought also a few publications from this. And I think I will stop there. I'm sorry, I forgot. Yes.
Thank you, Julia. And I think what you brought up is a very excellent summary that would pave us the way to closing remarks as we're trying to wrap up the session. And I think, as with the title of this session, which is Are Regulatory Practices Really Friend or Foe to Gender and Digital Rights, I would really be interested to hear from you what you think about in 30 seconds. Sorry, but we don't have time. So I'll go with Mahima first.
Sure, to be very brief, I'm based in India, and this country can be very patriarchal in its view towards women and the right that women have to be online. So I do believe that we need to, we need to protect women on the internet and not from the internet, which is sometimes the view that a very paternal government can take. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Mahima. Onika?
I think I will just briefly say that it's important as we continue to do this work to consistently recognize that online violence has offline impact and vice versa. And so it's really important that we continue to not see online violence in isolation to what actually happens to gender inequality in our society in general.
Thank you. Theo?
Thank you. So I'll just reiterate the point of making sure that any kind of future due diligence legislation really captures these issues. And then the other point is, of course, that any due diligence efforts include the affected and impacted stakeholders in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariana?
I think my answer is a friend if gender lenses are considered, and if there's a good understanding of the general context, social and legal. So then definitely a friend, but it can be an enemy too.
Thank you. Julia?
Maybe building on this, yes, and it needs to be built on collaborative approaches so that it's really a preventive, protective, but also in the end kind of an empowering tool, regulation. And one additional sentence, if I may, that I wanted to say before is that women's rights are always an early warning sign. So I think we really also have to link it to the general authoritarian trends we see across the globe and the backsliding of human rights. So this is an additional aspect where we need to fight for women's rights in digital spaces, linked also to the broader discussion on human rights and democracy.
Yeah, so collaborative approaches, dismantling institutionalized impunity, taking a full value chain approach, and protecting women on the internet and not from the internet. I think all those are really words that echo and have echoed during the session. So now we're going to take a few questions from the floor or from the online chat, if there are any, before wrapping up the session. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel and for platforming this conversation. My question is more for Mahima. You spoke about the UK and the US, but I'm wondering what are your interactions with regulatory frameworks that are perhaps hostile to products like Bumble, like I'm thinking of Pakistan or other countries perhaps in Asia or in the non-West? And secondly, how are you approaching protecting queer communities in, again, like countries or contexts where same-sex relationships might either be heavily discriminated against or even illegal? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more question. Yeah, Diana, go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for this great panel. I am from Jordan, and the culture of honor is very present in the everyday life. Even if it doesn't kill you, you live in the fear that it will at least harm you greatly. And there seems to be a lot of encouragement for us to speak up online, which is really good. And I see increased funding for lawyers for some high-profile cases, which is also good. But I was thinking, what can online communities do for the time that women are waiting for a result for their trials, as well as their lives afterwards? Because those two phases seems to be gaps in the programs addressed. And also it's probably the higher risk for them, because this is when they face the backlash. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. So I guess I'll go to Mahima for the first question.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. We are starting to engage with other countries. So we haven't engaged with all the countries out there, but certainly depending on where we find the conversation. I give the example of Australia because we have actually been involved with formal processes regarding how, the sector is going to be regulated. So it's quite drilled down in terms of the detailing. In India, for example, you will find a lot of laws that have been passed which capture some of the the tactics used against women online. But we've already hosted a number of conversations that we hope to lead into more formal reports and things which actually talk about whether the development of tech policy and then what is coming out actually has a gendered view in mind, and if we actually measure the impact on gender. And there's some researchers, frankly, who've done really good work in India. I'm sure some of the panelists are familiar with their work. We're drawing on their papers, we're drawing on their observations, and we're having these multi-stakeholder discussions with great participation from some of the think tanks and NGOs in India. As for making sure that we cater to all communities, in fact, as you know, Bumble was started more with that binary in mind. Our user base has obviously grown, so we actually work with GLAD in the US to make sure that our users can self-identify, and then that translated into having to kind of look at how the matching is done, because women make the first move. So in same-sex matches, anyone can make the first move. And similarly, when it comes to protecting different communities, we're working with groups to understand what further protections we can offer. I can give an example of women in India because we've done some work here, which is that they wanted actually their initials in their profiles and not their full name till they wanted to share it, because people were scared of their matches maybe finding them in other places on the internet. So that was the protection that we gave in India first, and then we'll roll it out in other places if people need that. So innovating, work in progress, but I can share that much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahima. We'll take another question. Final question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm Alan Kusuma from Indonesia. My organization has been focusing on online gender-based violence for quite few years, and we found a challenge that is very much has already been told here. I just want to raise an issue that we face when we are trying to get the online gender-based violence reported to the law enforcement, and the issue is there is a lack of digital evidence that we can get from the digital platforms, and there is also an issue of the law enforcement trying to get the victim to surrender their gadget, which also pose a privacy issue. So maybe is there any best practices from the digital platforms on having an evidence-based situation or evidence-based mechanism that can be easily accessed by the victim, so they can provide evidence to the police, and how maybe from the technical aspect, like the design of the gadget, when how can we get through the digital forensic without have to surrender our own privacy when we are giving the police our phone, for example. Maybe if there is any comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So who'd like to take Diana's question?
I can perhaps start. I think we've been seeing a lot of cases of trials involving violence against women and domestic violence that got really mediatized around the world, right? And I think the one thing that I think is important to say, you were referring to online communities and what could be done in between. I think it's really important that online communities, feminist movements, they provide support to the women who are going through this online, especially because we've seen from very mediatized cases, especially from the US and Europe, that campaigns and public opinion starts to shift to a very sexist view. And we've seen some cases also from the global south of trials that got very mediatized and in which the support, the feminist movement support for the woman who was who was on the trial was really important, be it for the public opinion, be it just for support. Of course, one can say that also the cases end up being influenced by this public opinion. That's a harder one to make. But anyway, I think it's really important that these discourses get mobilized, right? And then just to quickly address the part of evidence, I don't think I can answer to all of that, but for sure, the judiciary should have guidelines for access to evidence and for keeping evidence safe. And that's a problem that we've been seeing in many countries, that sometimes people won't want to report something because they know that they're not really secure practices, and perhaps something that they just want to keep private will get even more disseminated, right? I know that's not the full answer. You're referring to platforms, but just plugging on that.
Thank you, Mariana. Yeah, Annika?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on the part of platforms. I think it's really important that we continue the work. I think there's a piece of work stream that's going on right now under generation equality on the technology action platform that is looking at platforms themselves actually including some of these features in the design of the platforms. And I think it's really important for us to connect what is the discussions here and monitoring what's happening in that particular work stream, because I can certainly relate to what you're saying. The case that I talked about when we were opening, we actually had great difficulty defending the young women in court who were being sued for defamation of character by accused perpetrators, because the particular platform that they used to out these perpetrators was, well, accused perpetrators, as I'm supposed to say, was actually, they closed the account and took down the posts. We had screenshots of that, but had we not had screenshots of that, we would have just kind of been having a real great challenge being able to defend them. So I think that based on some of what we've been watching, there is a role for platforms to play, but it also goes to the whole issue of not overburdening victims of the violence with also defending themselves. You know, it is a form of secondary victimization where they now must continuously tell their story at every point and prove that this actually happened. And fundamentally, I think it's really important for us to connect this to what's happening in societal discourse, right? It all stems from a narrative of also not believing women. And therefore, the platforms have to play some role in that, because they also perpetuate this notion that, you know, women could be lying about this, and therefore, you know, they have to come to the fold around issues of making sure evidence is available.
Thank you so much, Anika, and thanks everyone for joining us here today. Not sure, Mahima, if you have anything to say? No?
You know, I can just add one thing, just picking up on the last point. I think design is really important. There was a case in Australia, I was on a different platform, which made it very clear that if the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator, unmatched, the victim was not able to access chats and so was not able to go and report. And so, when we, I mean, at least from a Bumble perspective, when we saw this in the news, we realized there was a design correction that needed to be made so that if someone has done something to you and then they block you or they unmatch you and you cannot find them to report them, that should be available. So yes, I agree. I think, platforms should make it easier to give people what they need to go get the justice they want.
Thank you, Mahima, and thank you for joining us online. Thanks everyone here today for joining us on a Friday afternoon. Yeah, I guess that's a wrap. Thank you.